When Emma Rodriguez first walked into the medical tent at Forward Operating Base Atlas, the silence that fell over the room wasn't one of respect. At 5 feet 2 inches and barely weighing 115 pounds, she looked more like someone's little sister who had wandered into the wrong place than a combat medic assigned to one of the most dangerous outposts in the theater. The snickers started almost immediately, followed by whispered comments about how the Corps must be getting desperate if they were sending children to do a Marine's job. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. But what those hardened warriors didn't know was that Emma had already proven herself in ways that would make most grown men question their own courage. What they couldn't see beneath that slight frame was a heart that burned with unshakable determination and hands that had already saved more lives than most of them had years in service. In just 72 hours, their laughter would turn to stunned silence, and then to something far more profound: absolute respect for the warrior who would risk everything to bring them all home alive. Emma Rodriguez had dreamed of serving her country since she was 12 years old, watching her older brother Miguel return home from his first deployment with stories that painted pictures of brotherhood, sacrifice, and purpose that civilian life simply couldn't match. Growing up in Riverside, California, in a family where money was always tight and opportunities seemed reserved for other people, the military represented something Emma had never had: a chance to prove that size didn't determine worth, that heart mattered more than height, and that courage came in all packages. Her parents, Maria and Carlos Rodriguez, had initially been horrified when their youngest daughter announced her intention to enlist. Maria would pull Emma aside during family dinners, gesturing at her daughter's petite frame and asking in rapid-fire Spanish how she expected to carry a pack that probably weighed more than she did. Carlos, a construction worker whose hands bore the permanent stains of honest labor, worried that his little girl would be broken by a world designed for much larger people. But Emma possessed something that transcended physical limitations: an absolute refusal to accept that her dreams were too big for her body. The journey to Forward Operating Base Atlas had been anything but smooth. During boot camp at Camp Pendleton, drill instructors had initially treated her like a liability, assuming she would wash out during the first week of physical training. Emma had endured months of being assigned to remedial fitness programs, being paired with the weakest recruits during team exercises, and hearing constant reminders that the Corps needed Marines who could carry their weight and then some. But every morning at 04:30, while her fellow recruits groaned their way out of their racks, Emma was already awake, mentally preparing for another day of proving herself one push-up, 1 mile, one obstacle at a time. Her decision to pursue combat medic training had raised even more eyebrows. The instructors at the Naval Medical Center had warned her that battlefield medicine required not just medical knowledge, but the physical capability to drag wounded Marines to safety while under fire. They painted vivid pictures of scenarios where she might need to carry someone twice her size across hostile terrain, where split-second decisions would mean the difference between bringing a Marine home alive or in a body bag. Emma had listened to every word, absorbed every warning, and then quietly excelled in every single aspect of her training. What her instructors discovered, much to their surprise, was that Emma possessed an almost supernatural ability to remain calm under pressure. While other trainees panicked during mass casualty simulations, Emma moved through the chaos with methodical precision, triaging patients with the efficiency of someone who had been doing the job for decades rather than months. Her small hands, which had initially seemed like a disadvantage, proved capable of intricate procedures that larger, less steady fingers struggled with. Her quiet voice, which some had mistaken for weakness, became a source of comfort to wounded Marines during the most terrifying moments of their lives. Master Sergeant David Chen, a 20-year veteran who had seen more battlefield medics than he cared to count, had pulled Emma aside during her final week of training. Chen was a man who rarely offered praise, someone whose approval was earned through blood, sweat, and an absolute commitment to excellence. His weathered face bore the scars of 3 combat deployments, and his reputation for producing the finest combat medics in the Corps was legendary. "Rodriguez," he had said, his voice carrying the weight of hard-earned wisdom, "I've been doing this job longer than you've been alive, and I've seen big, strong Marines crumble when the shooting starts. Size doesn't stop bullets, and muscles don't make decisions. What matters is what's up here." He tapped his temple. "And what's in here?" He placed his hand over his heart. "You've got both. Don't let anyone convince you otherwise." Those words had sustained Emma through the long journey to her first deployment. The transport plane that carried her across the Atlantic was filled with Marines who looked like they had been carved from granite, their conversation dominated by discussions of previous deployments, combat experiences, and the kind of casual bravado that comes with proven experience. Emma had spent most of that flight listening rather than talking, studying the faces of the men and women who would soon become her responsibility, memorizing the sound of their voices so she would recognize them even in the chaos of combat. Forward Operating Base Atlas sat in a valley surrounded by mountains that seemed to scrape the sky itself. The base was a collection of prefabricated buildings, defensive barriers, and equipment that represented America's commitment to bringing stability to a region that had known little peace for generations. The medical facility where Emma would spend most of her time was a testament to military efficiency, clean, well-equipped, and designed to handle everything from routine sick calls to mass casualty events that could overwhelm even the most experienced medical staff. Her first day had begun before dawn, as most days in the military do. Emma had reported to the medical tent at 0500, her uniform crisp, her gear properly arranged, and her mind focused on making the best possible first impression. What she found instead was a room full of Marines who looked at her like she was a puzzle they couldn't quite solve. The silence that greeted her entrance wasn't respectful, it was skeptical, tinged with the kind of doubt that comes when people see something that doesn't match their expectations. Staff Sergeant Jake Morrison, the squad leader whose approval would determine much of Emma's experience at the base, had been particularly vocal in his assessment. Morrison was everything Emma wasn't: 6 feet tall, broad-shouldered, with the kind of commanding presence that made other Marines instinctively straighten their posture when he entered a room. His voice carried the authority of someone who had earned his rank through combat experience, and his opinions carried weight with the men under his command. Well, Morrison had said, his voice carrying just enough humor to make his words seem like friendly observation rather than open mockery. "Looks like they're sending us high school students now. You sure you're in the right place, sweetheart? The USO might be looking for entertainment coordinators." The laughter that followed wasn't malicious, but it was dismissive, the kind of casual cruelty that military units sometimes inflict on newcomers who don't immediately fit the mold. Emma had endured similar comments throughout her training, but hearing them in what was supposed to be her new home, surrounded by Marines she might need to trust with her life, stung in a way she hadn't expected. Corporal Tyler Washington, another medic who had been at the base for 6 months, had tried to soften the blow with a sympathetic look, but even his expression carried doubt. Washington was a competent medic, well liked by the Marines and respected by the leadership, but Emma could see in his eyes the same question that seemed to follow her everywhere: could someone so small really handle the demands of combat medicine? The medical tent itself was a marvel of military engineering, equipped with everything needed to provide advanced trauma care in one of the most hostile environments on Earth. The main treatment area featured 6 beds, each surrounded by the kind of equipment that could mean the difference between life and death when minutes mattered more than miles. A separate area housed the pharmacy, surgical supplies, and the communication equipment that connected the base medical facility to hospitals hundreds of miles away. Emma had studied the layout during her pre-deployment briefing, but seeing it in person reinforced the magnitude of the responsibility she was accepting. Captain Sarah Mitchell, the company commander whose word was law within the confines of Forward Operating Base Atlas, had arrived for Emma's formal introduction with the bearing of someone who had earned her position through competence rather than politics. Mitchell was in her early 30s, a West Point graduate whose leadership style balanced compassion with the kind of unwavering standards that kept Marines alive in hostile territory. Her presence commanded immediate attention, and when she spoke, even Staff Sergeant Morrison listened with the respect due to superior rank and proven leadership. "Marines," Captain Mitchell had announced, her voice carrying the authority that came with responsibility for over 200 lives. "This is Corporal Rodriguez, our new combat medic. She comes to us with outstanding marks from the Naval Medical Center and a recommendation from Master Sergeant Chen that describes her as one of the finest medics he's trained in 2 decades. I expect you to treat her with the same respect you would show any Marine who has earned the right to wear our uniform." The captain's words carried weight, but Emma could see that respect would need to be earned rather than simply commanded. The Marines assembled in the medical tent were professionals who had learned to trust their lives to proven competence rather than official endorsements. They had seen too many replacements arrive with impressive credentials only to crumble when the pressure became real, when the training scenarios gave way to actual combat where mistakes cost lives rather than points on a scorecard. Emma's first week at Forward Operating Base Atlas had been a careful dance of proving herself without appearing to try too hard, of demonstrating competence without seeming arrogant, of finding her place within a unit that had already established its rhythms and hierarchies. She had thrown herself into learning the specific procedures and protocols that govern medical operations at the base, studying the injury patterns common to the area, and familiarizing herself with the personalities and medical histories of the Marines under her care. The base's mission was officially described as humanitarian support and infrastructure protection, but everyone understood that Forward Operating Base Atlas existed in a region where the line between peacekeeping and combat operations could disappear without warning. The Marines stationed there were responsible for protecting supply convoys that brought medicine and food to civilian populations, for maintaining the communication networks that connected isolated communities to the outside world, and for providing the security that allowed international aid organizations to operate in areas that would otherwise be too dangerous for civilian personnel. Emma's days had quickly fallen into a routine that began before dawn and ended well after sunset. Morning sick call brought a steady stream of Marines dealing with everything from minor injuries to illnesses that could become serious without proper treatment. The afternoon hours were usually dedicated to training exercises, equipment maintenance, and the endless paperwork that seemed to follow medical personnel everywhere the military operated. Evenings were reserved for studying, for reviewing the day's cases, and for the kind of professional development that separated adequate medics from exceptional ones. But it was during the quiet moments, when the base settled into the relative calm of evening, that Emma found herself confronting the doubts that her fellow Marines were careful not to voice directly. She could see it in their eyes when they thought she wasn't looking, could hear it in the conversations that stopped when she entered a room, could feel it in the way they automatically assumed she would need help with tasks that she was perfectly capable of handling alone. The physical demands of the job were exactly what everyone expected them to be. Emma's gear, including her medical pack, body armor and weapon, weighed nearly 60 pounds, more than half her body weight. The mountain terrain around Forward Operating Base Atlas was unforgiving, with steep trails that challenged even the most physically fit Marines, and altitude that left newcomers gasping for breath during routine patrols. The heat during the day was oppressive, while nights brought a cold that seemed to penetrate even the most advanced military equipment. But Emma had not come this far to be defeated by challenges she had known she would face. Every morning she rose 30 minutes earlier than required to complete additional physical training, pushing her small frame through exercises designed to build the kind of endurance that would be essential if she ever needed to carry wounded Marines across hostile terrain. Every evening she spent additional time reviewing medical procedures, studying the tactical situations that might require her intervention, and preparing for scenarios that she hoped would never occur but knew she needed to be ready to handle. The breakthrough in her relationship with the unit came not through any dramatic gesture, but through the kind of quiet competence that military professionals eventually recognize and respect. During her third week at the base, Private First Class Kevin Brooks had been brought to the medical tent suffering from what appeared to be a routine case of food poisoning. Emma's initial examination had revealed symptoms that were concerning but not immediately life-threatening, but something about the pattern didn't match her expectations for a simple digestive issue. While other medics might have provided supportive care and expected the Marine to recover within a day or two, Emma had pressed for additional tests, had asked more detailed questions about Brooks's recent activities, and had ultimately identified what turned out to be the early stages of a serious infection that could have become life-threatening if left untreated. Her intervention had not only saved Brooks from a potentially dangerous medical emergency, but had prevented the spread of an infection that could have affected other Marines on the base. Staff Sergeant Morrison, who had been initially skeptical of the diagnosis that had led to Brooks being evacuated to a larger medical facility, had received confirmation that Emma's assessment had been completely accurate. The infection that she had identified would indeed have become serious, possibly fatal if it had progressed without treatment. Morrison's acknowledgement of her medical judgment had been grudging, but it represented the first crack in the wall of skepticism that surrounded Emma's presence at Forward Operating Base Atlas. Word of Emma's diagnostic success had spread through the base with the speed that all news travels in military units, growing slightly in the telling but maintaining its essential truth. The new medic, despite her small size and youthful appearance, possessed medical knowledge and instincts that had already saved one Marine's life. The change in attitude wasn't dramatic, but it was noticeable. Marines who had previously treated her with polite but distant courtesy began asking her questions about their own minor medical concerns, seeking her advice on injuries they might have ignored or dismissed. Emma understood that earning full acceptance within the unit would require more than medical competence. Important as that was, combat units developed trust through shared hardship, through witnessing how individuals responded when comfortable routines gave way to dangerous uncertainty. She knew that until she had been tested under fire, until she had proven that her courage matched her medical skills, there would always be Marines who wondered whether she possessed the warrior spirit that defined their brotherhood. Part 2. The challenge emerges. The morning of October 15th dawned gray and oppressive, with heavy clouds hanging low over the mountains surrounding Forward Operating Base Atlas like a shroud. Emma had been at the base for exactly 28 days, long enough to establish her daily routines but not long enough to feel completely integrated into the tight-knit community of Marines who called this remote outpost home. The air carried the scent of rain and something else, something that the veteran Marines recognized as the kind of atmospheric pressure that preceded significant weather changes and often increased enemy activity. Captain Sarah Mitchell stood in the briefing room addressing the assembled Marines with the kind of controlled tension that came from receiving intelligence reports that painted concerning pictures. The wooden chairs creaked under the weight of fully equipped Marines, their gear arranged with the precision that came from months of shared deployment experience. Emma sat near the back, her medical pack positioned beside her chair, her notebook open to record any information that might affect medical preparedness for whatever mission was about to be announced. Intelligence reports indicate increased movement in the mountain passes leading to the civilian settlements we've been supporting, Captain Mitchell began, her voice carrying the authority that came from making life and death decisions on a daily basis. The humanitarian convoy scheduled for tomorrow will be carrying medical supplies to 3 villages that haven't received resupply in over 2 weeks. The route takes us through Devil's Canyon, a narrow pass that offers excellent defensive positions for anyone wanting to interfere with our mission. Staff Sergeant Morrison leaned forward in his chair, his weathered face reflecting the kind of concern that came from understanding tactical situations better than most people understood their own neighborhoods. Morrison had been through Devil's Canyon twice before, both times without incident, but he possessed the kind of battlefield intuition that recognized when familiar situations might become unexpectedly dangerous. His eyes swept the room, mentally cataloging the Marines under his command, assessing their readiness for what might become their first significant combat engagement of the deployment. The convoy will consist of 3 vehicles, Captain Mitchell continued, pointing to a map that showed the winding route through mountainous terrain, 2 Humvees providing security escort, and 1 supply truck carrying approximately 2 tons of medical supplies, food, and communication equipment. The civilian population in these villages has been without adequate medical support since their local clinic was damaged in fighting 3 weeks ago. Our mission is to deliver these supplies safely and assess whether additional support operations will be necessary. Emma studied the map with the intensity of someone who understood that geography could mean the difference between successful mission completion and catastrophic failure. Devil's Canyon was a natural choke point, a narrow passage between steep rock faces that would funnel the convoy through terrain where maneuverability would be severely limited. The route offered multiple positions where hostile forces could establish ambush points while maintaining concealed escape routes through terrain that vehicles couldn't navigate. From a medical perspective, the canyon represented a nightmare scenario where wounded personnel might be trapped in positions that would make evacuation extremely difficult. The briefing continued with detailed discussions of communications protocols, emergency procedures, and contingency plans for various scenarios that might develop during the mission. Emma absorbed every word, understanding that her role would extend far beyond providing routine medical support if the convoy encountered serious opposition. In combat situations, medics became the lifeline that kept Marines fighting, the difference between minor injuries that could be treated in the field and serious wounds that required immediate evacuation to save lives. Lance Corporal Marcus Johnson raised his hand during the question period, his young face reflecting the kind of nervous energy that came from anticipating his first potential combat engagement. Johnson was 19 years old, a radio operator whose technical skills were excellent, but whose battlefield experience was limited to training exercises that, however realistic, couldn't fully replicate the psychological pressure of actual combat. His voice carried a slight tremor when he asked about evacuation procedures if the convoy became trapped in the canyon. Medical evacuation from Devil's Canyon would be extremely challenging, Captain Mitchell replied honestly, her tone acknowledging the seriousness of the tactical situation without creating unnecessary panic. Helicopter extraction would be difficult due to the narrow confines and potential for hostile fire from elevated positions. Ground evacuation might require fighting our way back through the same choke points that could trap us initially. This is why mission planning emphasizes avoiding engagement whenever possible and maintaining communication with base throughout the operation. Emma felt the weight of responsibility settling on her shoulders like a physical burden. In training scenarios, medical personnel always had backup, always had support systems that could compensate for individual limitations or equipment failures. In Devil's Canyon, she would be the only qualified medical professional for potentially 20 Marines whose lives might depend on her ability to function under the most challenging conditions imaginable. The realization was simultaneously terrifying and exhilarating, representing everything she had trained for and everything she had feared since deciding to pursue combat medicine. After the briefing concluded, Marines began the process of equipment preparation that preceded every significant mission. Weapons were cleaned and inspected, communication equipment was tested and retested, and personal gear was arranged with a kind of meticulous attention to detail that reflected understanding that forgotten items or mechanical failures could have fatal consequences. Emma spent the afternoon reviewing her medical supplies, checking expiration dates on medications, and mentally rehearsing procedures for treating various types of combat injuries under field conditions. Staff Sergeant Morrison approached her during this preparation period, his expression carrying the kind of serious concern that preceded conversations about life and death matters. Morrison had been observing Emma's integration into the unit for nearly a month, noting her medical competence while remaining skeptical about her ability to function effectively under combat stress. His years of experience had taught him that battlefield performance often differed dramatically from training performance, that individuals who excelled in controlled environments sometimes struggled when chaos replaced order. "Rodriguez," Morrison said, his voice carrying the weight of command responsibility, "tomorrow might be your first taste of real combat medicine. I need to know that you understand what that means, that you're prepared for situations that don't match the textbook scenarios you studied in medical training." Emma looked up from her medical pack, meeting Morrison's gaze directly despite the intimidation she felt when confronting someone whose combat experience dwarfed her own. She had anticipated this conversation, had prepared for the moment when her squad leader would question her readiness for the mission that everyone understood might become significantly more dangerous than routine convoy escort duties. "I understand the risk, Staff Sergeant," Emma replied, her voice steady despite the nervous energy that threatened to make her words tremble. "I've studied the tactical medical challenges specific to canyon environments, and I've prepared for scenarios involving multiple casualties under hostile fire. I know that battlefield medicine requires different skills than hospital medicine, that I might need to make treatment decisions under pressure that I've never experienced before." Morrison studied her face, looking for signs of the overconfidence that sometimes masked inadequate preparation, or the fear that could paralyze decision-making when quick action was essential. What he saw instead was the kind of quiet determination that he had learned to recognize in Marines who possessed the mental toughness necessary for combat operations. Emma's acknowledgement of the challenges she would face demonstrated realistic assessment rather than naive optimism, suggesting that she understood the seriousness of her responsibilities without being overwhelmed by them. "The thing about combat medicine," Morrison continued, his tone becoming more instructional than interrogational, "is that you don't get second chances to make first impressions. When Marines are bleeding and scared, they need to see confidence in their medic, need to believe that the person treating them knows exactly what they're doing, even when the situation is chaotic and confusing. Size doesn't matter when you're stopping bleeding or establishing airways, but leadership does. Can you provide that kind of leadership when 20 Marines are depending on you to keep them alive?" The question struck at the heart of Emma's deepest concerns about her role within the unit. Medical knowledge and technical skills were quantifiable, measurable through tests and practical examinations that provided objective assessments of competence. Leadership, however, was intangible, something that emerged from the complex interaction between personal confidence, professional competence, and the ability to inspire trust in others during moments of extreme stress. Emma considered Morrison's question carefully before responding, understanding that her answer would influence not only his assessment of her readiness, but also her own confidence in her ability to fulfill her responsibilities during the upcoming mission. She thought about Master Sergeant Chen's words during her final week of training, about the importance of mental strength and emotional resilience in determining success as a combat medic. "Staff Sergeant, I can't promise that I won't be scared tomorrow, because I think anyone who isn't scared in combat is probably dangerous," Emma replied, choosing her words with the precision that came from understanding their importance. "But I can promise that I'll do everything in my power to take care of the Marines in my squad, that I'll use every skill I've learned and every piece of knowledge I've gained to make sure that everyone who can be saved will be saved. I know that my size makes some Marines doubt my capabilities, but I've never let physical limitations determine what I could accomplish." Morrison nodded slowly, his expression suggesting that Emma's response had met his expectations without necessarily eliminating all his concerns. Combat would be the ultimate test of her capabilities, the environment where training and determination would either prove sufficient or reveal gaps that could have fatal consequences. Morrison's responsibility as squad leader meant that he would be held accountable for the performance of every Marine under his command, including the medic, whose competence could determine whether his Marines came home alive or in body bags. The remainder of the day passed with the kind of controlled tension that preceded significant military operations. Marines wrote letters home that they might not have the opportunity to send for several days, checked and rechecked equipment that might mean the difference between life and death, and engaged in the kind of nervous conversation that helped process the anxiety that came with anticipating potential combat.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Emma spent the evening reviewing her medical protocols one final time, organizing her supplies for maximum efficiency under field conditions, and mentally preparing for scenarios that she hoped would remain theoretical. Corporal Tyler Washington approached her as she completed her final equipment checks, his expression reflecting the kind of professional concern that came from understanding the challenges that medics face during combat operations. Washington had been through several convoy missions during his 6 months at Forward Operating Base Atlas, including one that had involved minor contact with hostile forces, giving him experience that Emma lacked but would soon gain. "The first time is always the hardest," Washington said, settling into a chair beside Emma's workstation. "Not just because you don't know what to expect, but because you're carrying all this training and knowledge, and you're not sure how it's going to translate when the bullets start flying and Marines are screaming for help." Emma appreciated Washington's attempt to provide reassurance, understanding that his willingness to share his experience represented a form of acceptance that had been developing gradually during her time at the base. Washington's combat experience gave his words weight that purely theoretical knowledge couldn't match, and his insights into the psychological challenges of battlefield medicine were valuable in ways that medical textbooks couldn't replicate. "How do you manage the pressure?" Emma asked,
genuinely curious about the mental strategies that allowed medics to function effectively under combat stress. I mean, I know the medical procedures, I understand the technical aspects of trauma care, but I'm not sure how I'll react when I'm trying to treat someone while people are shooting at us. Washington smiled grimly, his expression reflecting memories of experiences that had tested his own capabilities in ways that peacetime training never could. His response carried the weight of hard-earned wisdom, the kind of insight that came from surviving situations where theoretical knowledge had been put to the ultimate practical test. "You focus on the Marine in front of you," Washington replied, his voice carrying the certainty that came from proven experience. "Everything else becomes background noise when you're concentrating on stopping bleeding or establishing an airway. The shooting, the shouting, the chaos, it all fades away when you're focused on the medical problem you need to solve. Trust your training, trust your instincts, and remember that every Marine you treat successfully is someone's son or daughter who gets to go home alive." That evening, Emma lay in her narrow bunk listening to the sounds of a military base settling into the relative quiet of night. The generator that powered essential systems hummed steadily, providing the background noise that had become as familiar as breathing during her month at Forward Operating Base Atlas. Through the thin walls of the barracks she could hear other Marines engaging in quiet conversations, some discussing the next day's mission, others talking about home, family, and the civilian lives they would return to when their deployment ended. Sleep came fitfully, interrupted by dreams that mixed memories of medical training with imagined scenarios of combat situations she had never experienced. Emma found herself treating wounded Marines in environments that shifted between the controlled conditions of medical school and the chaotic circumstances she expected to encounter in Devil's Canyon. Her subconscious mind processed the anxiety and anticipation that came with approaching her first potential combat engagement, creating vivid scenarios that felt simultaneously realistic and surreal. The pre-dawn hours brought the familiar sounds of a military base preparing for operations, the metallic clatter of equipment being loaded, the low voices of Marines conducting final equipment checks, and the diesel rumble of vehicles being prepared for the day's mission. Emma rose 30 minutes before her required reporting time, using the extra minutes to complete a final review of her medical supplies and to center herself mentally for whatever challenges the day might bring. In the medical tent she arranged her gear with the methodical precision that came from understanding that organization could mean the difference between life and death when seconds mattered more than comfort. Her medical pack contained supplies for treating everything from minor cuts to traumatic injuries that would require immediate intervention to prevent death from blood loss. Each item was positioned for maximum accessibility, arranged according to protocols that had been refined through decades of combat medical experience. Captain Mitchell appeared in the medical tent as Emma completed her preparations, her presence commanding immediate attention from everyone present. The captain's expression reflected the kind of controlled tension that came from responsibility for planning operations where small mistakes could have large consequences, where tactical decisions made in comfortable briefing rooms would be tested in environments where theoretical knowledge met practical reality. "Rodriguez," Captain Mitchell said, her voice carrying the authority that came with command responsibility, "you understand that today's mission could become your first real test as a combat medic. I need to know that you're mentally prepared for that possibility, that you understand the responsibilities you're accepting when you climb into that convoy vehicle." Emma stood at attention, meeting her commanding officer's gaze directly despite the nervousness that threatened to overwhelm her confidence. Captain Mitchell's question was more than a routine check of readiness. It was an opportunity for Emma to demonstrate the kind of mental toughness that would be essential if the convoy encountered serious opposition during its passage through Devil's Canyon. "Ma'am, I'm ready to fulfill my responsibilities as a combat medic," Emma replied, her voice carrying the conviction that came from months of preparation and training. "I understand that Marines' lives may depend on my performance today, and I'm prepared to do everything in my power to ensure that everyone in our convoy comes home safely." Captain Mitchell nodded, her expression suggesting satisfaction with Emma's response, while acknowledging the uncertainty that surrounded any combat operation. Leadership in military organizations required balancing confidence in subordinates' abilities with realistic assessment of the challenges they would face, understanding that even the best prepared Marines could encounter situations that exceeded their training or experience. The convoy vehicles waited in the pre-dawn darkness like sleeping beasts, their armored hulls reflecting the harsh lights that illuminated the base's vehicle staging area. Emma approached her assigned Humvee with the mixture of anticipation and apprehension that came with approaching her first potential combat engagement, understanding that the next several hours would either validate her years of training or reveal gaps in her preparation that could have fatal consequences for the Marines depending on her medical expertise. Part 3. Into the Fire. The convoy rolled out of Forward Operating Base Atlas at 0600 hours, 3 vehicles moving in tactical formation through the mountain landscape that stretched endlessly toward horizons shrouded in morning mist. Emma sat in the rear seat of the lead Humvee, her medical pack secured beside her, her M4 carbine positioned within easy reach according to protocols that required even medical personnel to be prepared for combat engagement. The vehicle's armored interior was cramped, filled with the scent of diesel fuel, gun oil, and the nervous sweat that accompanied Marines heading into potentially hostile territory. Private First Class Kevin Brooks, the Marine whose life Emma had saved during her third week at the base, occupied the driver's seat with the kind of focused concentration that came from understanding that his vehicle handling skills might determine whether his fellow Marines survived the day. Brooks had requested assignment to Emma's vehicle, telling Staff Sergeant Morrison that he wanted to serve alongside the medic who had demonstrated such exceptional diagnostic skills during his medical emergency. His presence represented the first tangible sign that Emma was beginning to earn the trust and respect of the Marines she served. Lance Corporal Marcus Johnson rode in the passenger seat, his radio equipment crackling with periodic communications from the other convoy vehicles and from forward operating base Atlas. Johnson's nervous energy was palpable, his hands constantly adjusting his equipment, checking his weapon and scanning the terrain through his vehicle's armored windows for signs of potential threats. This was his first convoy mission through potentially hostile territory, and his inexperience was evident in the way his eyes darted constantly between his radio and the mountainous landscape surrounding the convoy route. The mountain road wound through terrain that seemed designed by nature to challenge military vehicles. Steep grades tested the Humvee's mechanical systems while narrow passages between rock formations created natural choke points where the convoy's maneuverability was severely limited. Emma studied the landscape through her window, her medical training causing her to automatically assess potential casualty collection points, evacuation routes, and defensive positions that might be necessary if the convoy encountered hostile forces. Staff Sergeant Morrison's voice crackled through the radio, providing tactical updates and maintaining communication between the three convoy vehicles as they navigated increasingly challenging terrain. Morrison rode in the trailing security vehicle, positioning himself where he could observe the convoy's rear approaches while maintaining command and control over the entire mission. His periodic radio checks reflected the kind of professional vigilance that kept Marines alive in environments where complacency could have fatal consequences. The first 2 hours of the journey passed without incident, the convoy making steady progress through mountain passes that offered breathtaking views of valleys and peaks that seemed untouched by human conflict. Emma found herself appreciating the stark beauty of the landscape, while remaining constantly aware that the same terrain features that created such impressive vistas also provided excellent concealment for hostile forces that might be observing the convoy's movement. Private Danny Williams, the youngest Marine in the convoy at 18 years old, had been unusually quiet during the mission briefing and remained silent as the vehicles climbed steadily through mountain passes that seemed to reach toward the gray clouds overhead. Williams was a machine gunner whose technical proficiency with his weapon was excellent, but whose combat experience was limited to training exercises that, however realistic, couldn't fully replicate the psychological pressure of potential engagement with hostile forces determined to kill American Marines. As the convoy approached the entrance to Devil's Canyon, the tactical situation became increasingly tense. The narrow passage between steep rock walls represented exactly the kind of terrain that military planners feared, a natural funnel that would channel the vehicles through predictable routes while offering multiple concealed positions for potential ambush forces. Emma could feel the change in atmosphere inside her vehicle as the Marines' casual conversation gave way to the focused alertness that preceded entry into potentially hostile territory. Captain Mitchell's voice came through the radio with updated intelligence that had been transmitted from forward operating base Atlas during the convoy's journey. Reconnaissance elements had reported increased radio communications in the Devil's Canyon area, suggesting possible hostile activity that might affect the convoy's passage through the narrow mountain pass. The intelligence was inconclusive, offering no specific threats while confirming that the tactical situation remained fluid and potentially dangerous. The entrance to Devil's Canyon loomed ahead like the mouth of some enormous predator, a narrow gap between towering rock formations that seemed to swallow the morning light. Emma checked her medical equipment one final time, ensuring that essential supplies were positioned for immediate access if the tactical situation deteriorated rapidly. Her hands moved through familiar motions that provided psychological comfort while confirming that she was as prepared as training and experience could make her for whatever challenges lay ahead. Lance Corporal Johnson's radio crackled with increasing frequency as the convoy entered the canyon, carrying communications between the three vehicles and periodic updates from forward operating base Atlas. The narrow confines of the canyon created communication challenges, with radio signals bouncing off rock walls in ways that sometimes distorted transmissions, or created brief periods where contact with the base was lost entirely. Johnson's experience with radio equipment proved valuable as he adjusted frequencies and power levels to maintain reliable communications despite the challenging terrain. The convoy had penetrated approximately halfway through Devil's Canyon when the first sign of trouble appeared. Private Brooks, whose driving skills had been exemplary throughout the journey, noticed movement on the canyon walls above the convoy route. The movement was brief, possibly nothing more than falling rocks or wildlife, but Brooks's combat training had taught him to report anything unusual rather than risk missing signs of potential hostile activity. Staff Sergeant Morrison's response to Brooks's report was immediate and professional, ordering the convoy to increase speed while maintaining tactical formation. Morrison's years of combat experience had taught him to trust his Marines' observations, understanding that survival in hostile territory often depended on recognizing subtle signs of danger before they developed into direct threats. His voice over the radio carried the kind of calm authority that helped maintain unit cohesion during periods of increasing tension. Emma felt her heart rate increase as the convoy accelerated through the narrow canyon passage, the vehicle's engines straining against the steep grades while their suspension systems absorbed the impact of increasingly rough terrain. Her medical training had included instruction on treating motion sickness and the psychological effects of prolonged stress, but experiencing the physical sensations of approaching potential combat was different from studying theoretical descriptions of how Marines might react under pressure. The ambush, when it came, erupted with the sudden violence that characterized most combat engagements. The first indication of hostile contact was the sharp crack of rifle fire echoing off the canyon walls, followed immediately by the metallic impact of bullets striking the lead vehicle's armor. Emma's world exploded into chaos as her Humvee swerved violently, Brooks fighting to maintain control while hostile fire poured down from concealed positions on both sides of the narrow canyon. Lance Corporal Johnson's radio burst into activity as he attempted to report contact with hostile forces while simultaneously trying to coordinate defensive actions between the three convoy vehicles. His voice carried the strain of someone experiencing combat for the first time, his training competing with natural fear as he struggled to maintain communications protocols while bullets shattered the armored windows around him. The sound of automatic weapons fire filled the canyon like thunder, echoing off rock walls and creating a cacophony that made communication between Marines nearly impossible without shouting. Emma found herself pressed against the floor of the Humvee as Brooks maneuvered the vehicle through terrain that seemed designed to trap them in a killing zone where hostile forces held every tactical advantage. Private First Class Brooks demonstrated exceptional driving skills as he navigated the damaged Humvee through increasingly difficult terrain, while under continuous fire from multiple directions. His hands gripped the steering wheel with white-knuckled determination as he fought to keep the vehicle moving despite mechanical damage that was affecting its performance. Brooks' concentration on his driving responsibilities allowed other Marines in the vehicle to focus on returning fire and maintaining communications with the other convoy elements. The second vehicle in the convoy, carrying the medical supplies that represented the mission's primary objective, took a direct hit from what sounded like rocket-propelled grenade fire. The explosion illuminated the canyon walls with brilliant orange light, while sending shockwaves through the narrow passage that seemed to shake the very mountains themselves. Emma watched through her damaged window as the supply truck veered off the narrow road and crashed into the canyon wall, its cargo of life-saving medical supplies scattered across the rocky terrain. Staff Sergeant Morrison's voice cut through the radio static with orders that reflected years of combat experience and tactical knowledge. His commands were precise and professional, directing the convoy's defensive actions while assessing the tactical situation and planning extraction procedures that might save Marines' lives under impossible circumstances. Morrison's leadership during the ambush demonstrated exactly why he held the respect of every Marine under his command. The third vehicle, Morrison's trailing security Humvee, attempted to maneuver into a position where its heavier weapons could provide suppressive fire against the hostile positions overlooking the convoy route. The tactical situation was deteriorating rapidly, with the convoy trapped in terrain that offered minimal cover while hostile forces maintained commanding positions on the canyon walls above. Morrison's vehicle took multiple hits as it moved to support the other convoy elements, its armor deflecting some rounds while others found gaps in the protective plating. Emma's medical training had prepared her for the sounds of combat, but experiencing the reality of Marines calling for medical assistance while under fire was different from any simulation she had encountered. The first call for a medic came from Morrison's vehicle, where Marine casualties were mounting as hostile fire concentrated on the convoy's heaviest weapons platform. Emma could hear the pain and fear in voices that had been confident and professional just minutes earlier. Private Brooks managed to maneuver their damaged Humvee into a defensive position that offered minimal protection from the hostile fire pouring down from the canyon walls. The vehicle's engine was smoking from damage sustained during the ambush, and several of its systems were failing as bullet holes allowed critical fluids to leak onto the rocky ground. Brooks' driving had kept them alive during the initial moments of the engagement, but their tactical situation remained desperate. Lance Corporal Johnson continued his attempts to maintain radio communications with Forward Operating Base Atlas, trying to coordinate immediate support while providing tactical updates about the convoy's situation. The canyon's narrow confines made helicopter evacuation impossible, while the terrain features that trapped the convoy also prevented ground reinforcements from reaching them quickly. Johnson's radio calls painted a picture of Marines trapped in a tactical nightmare with limited options for escape or rescue. The hostile fire seemed to come from everywhere at once, with muzzle flashes appearing and disappearing among the rocks above the convoy route like deadly fireflies. Emma estimated that the attacking force numbered at least 15 to 20 fighters, all positioned in carefully prepared positions that offered excellent fields of fire while providing protection from the convoy's return fire. The ambush demonstrated the kind of tactical planning that suggested professional military training rather than random opportunistic attack. Staff Sergeant Morrison's voice over the radio carried increasing urgency as he requested immediate medical assistance for casualties in his vehicle. Emma could hear automatic weapons fire in the background of his transmission, along with voices calling for help in tones that suggested serious injuries requiring immediate treatment. Morrison's professional composure was beginning to show strain as he balanced his command responsibilities with the need to care for wounded Marines under his leadership. Emma made the decision that would define her military career without conscious thought, driven by training and instinct rather than careful analysis of tactical risks. She grabbed her medical pack and prepared to leave the relative safety of her damaged Humvee to cross open ground under fire, moving toward Morrison's vehicle where Marines were bleeding and dying while waiting for medical assistance that might mean the difference between life and death. Private Brooks immediately protested Emma's decision, understanding that movement between vehicles would expose her to concentrated fire from hostile positions that commanded excellent views of the entire canyon floor. His concern was both professional and personal, recognizing that losing their medic would doom any Marines who sustained serious injuries during the remainder of the engagement. Brooks' objections reflected the tactical reality that Emma's survival was essential for the entire convoy's chances of avoiding catastrophic casualties. Lance Corporal Johnson added his voice to Brooks's protests, pointing out that radio communications with forward operating base Atlas indicated that support elements were attempting to reach the convoy's position. Johnson's argument was that Emma should wait for additional support before exposing herself to the concentrated fire that had already disabled one convoy vehicle and was systematically destroying the others. His logic was sound from a tactical perspective, but Emma understood that wounded Marines might not survive the time required for reinforcements to reach their position. Emma's response to her fellow Marines' concerns was brief and decisive, reflecting the kind of leadership that Morrison had questioned during their conversation before the mission. She acknowledged the tactical risks while explaining that her medical oath required her to provide treatment to wounded Marines regardless of personal danger. Her words carried the quiet authority that came from absolute commitment to her responsibilities as a combat medic. The hostile fire intensified as Emma prepared to leave her vehicle, suggesting that the attacking forces had observed movement within the convoy and were concentrating their efforts on preventing any tactical coordination between the damaged vehicles. Bullets struck the rocky ground around the convoy with increasing frequency, sending stone fragments flying through the air like deadly confetti while the sound of ricochets added to the cacophony that filled the narrow canyon. Emma's last communication with Private Brooks before leaving the vehicle was a request that he maintain radio contact with Staff Sergeant Morrison and be prepared to provide covering fire during her movement to the casualty collection point. Brooks' acknowledgement carried the weight of someone accepting responsibility for another Marine's life, understanding that his actions during the next few minutes might determine whether Emma survived her attempt to reach wounded Marines who needed immediate medical attention. The canyon floor stretched between Emma's position and Morrison's damaged vehicle like a lunar landscape, rocky and uneven, offering minimal concealment from the hostile positions overlooking the convoy route. Emma studied the terrain briefly, identifying potential cover positions and planning a movement route that might offer the best chances of survival during her dash across ground that was swept by concentrated enemy fire. Her medical pack felt heavier than usual as Emma prepared for movement, loaded with supplies that represented the difference between life and death for Marines whose injuries required immediate treatment. Every item in the pack had been selected and positioned according to protocols developed through decades of combat medical experience, arranged to provide maximum treatment capability while remaining manageable during tactical movement under fire. The moment Emma left the protection of her damaged Humvee marked the beginning of her transformation from questioned newcomer to respected warrior, though she had no way of knowing that her actions during the next few hours would earn the kind of respect that no amount of training or credentials could provide. Her first steps across the open ground were taken under fire that seemed designed to kill anyone foolish enough to expose themselves to the hostile positions commanding the canyon. Staff Sergeant Morrison's voice over the radio provided a constant stream of tactical updates and encouragement as Emma moved across terrain that offered minimal protection from the concentrated fire pouring down from above. Morrison's professional composure was remarkable given the tactical situation and the casualties his vehicle had sustained. But Emma could hear the strain in his voice as he balanced command responsibilities with concern for the medic risking her life to reach his wounded Marines. Part 4. The Ultimate Test. Emma's boots hit the rocky canyon floor with a determination that surprised even her, each step carrying her closer to Staff Sergeant Morrison's disabled vehicle where the urgent voices of wounded Marines cut through the chaos of automatic weapons fire. The distance between vehicles, which had seemed manageable during tactical planning, now stretched like an eternity of exposed ground where every rock formation and depression became a potential shield against the deadly rain of bullets cascading from the canyon walls above. The first wounded Marine she reached was Corporal James Lee, Morrison's vehicle commander, who had taken shrapnel from an explosive round that had detonated against their Humvee's armored plating. Lee's injuries were serious but not immediately life-threatening, requiring rapid assessment and treatment that would stabilize him for eventual evacuation while allowing Emma to continue treating other casualties whose conditions might be more critical. Blood soaked through Lee's uniform at multiple points, creating a visual assessment challenge that required Emma to systematically examine each wound site while maintaining awareness of the tactical situation around her. Emma's hands moved with mechanical precision as she applied pressure dressings to Lee's most serious wounds, her medical training overriding the natural fear response that threatened to paralyze her decision-making processes. The sound of bullets striking nearby rocks created a percussion symphony that accompanied her work, but Emma found that Corporal Washington's advice had been accurate. Focusing on the medical problem in front of her caused everything else to fade into manageable background noise. Private Danny Williams lay unconscious beside the disabled vehicle's rear wheel, his machine gun silent beside him, a stream of blood flowing from a head wound that looked worse than it actually was. Emma's rapid assessment revealed a scalp laceration that was bleeding profusely but hadn't penetrated the skull, requiring immediate attention to control bleeding while ensuring that Williams' airway remained clear. Her small hands proved advantageous as she worked in the cramped space between the vehicle and the canyon wall, applying bandages with the kind of precision that larger fingers might have struggled to achieve. Staff Sergeant Morrison appeared beside Emma with his left arm hanging useless at his side, his uniform torn and blood-stained, but his voice still carrying the authority that kept Marines focused on their responsibilities despite the chaos surrounding them. Morrison's injury was a through-and-through bullet wound in his shoulder that was painful but not life-threatening, though it had effectively removed him from active combat participation. His presence beside Emma as she worked represented the kind of leadership that inspired Marines to perform beyond their perceived limitations. "Rodriguez, we've got more casualties in the supply truck," Morrison said, his voice strained but professional despite the obvious pain from his wound. "The driver and 2 Marines who were riding security are trapped in there, and I can't get close enough to assess their condition. The hostile fire is too concentrated around that position." The tactical situation around the supply truck was significantly worse than her current position, with multiple overlapping fields of fire that would make approach extremely dangerous. Yet the knowledge that Marines were trapped and potentially dying in that vehicle made the decision inevitable. Lance Corporal Maria Santos, one of Morrison's Marines, had taken a bullet through her leg that had struck bone, creating a fracture that would require immediate immobilization to prevent further damage.
Emma worked quickly to apply a splint fashioned from equipment available in the disabled vehicle, using techniques learned during field medicine training that emphasized improvisation when standard medical supplies were unavailable. Santos remained conscious and alert despite her pain, providing security with her rifle while Emma treated her injury. The hostile fire pattern seemed to shift as Emma moved between casualties, suggesting that the attacking forces were attempting to target the medical treatment activities that might keep Marines' combat effective. Emma noticed that muzzle flashes appeared more frequently when she was visible to the elevated positions, indicating that the enemy fighters recognized the tactical importance of eliminating medical personnel who could keep wounded Marines in the fighting. Private Alex Thompson crawled toward Emma's position carrying another wounded Marine, Corporal Lisa Park, whose injuries appeared more serious than those Emma had treated so far. Park had taken multiple bullet wounds in her torso, requiring immediate intervention to prevent shock and blood loss that could become fatal within minutes. Emma's assessment revealed that Park needed surgical intervention that was beyond field medical capabilities, but immediate treatment might stabilize her condition long enough for evacuation to a proper medical facility. Emma's medical pack contained blood clotting agents and emergency surgical supplies that could provide temporary solutions to traumatic injuries, but treating Park's wounds would require her to remain exposed to enemy fire for an extended period while performing procedures that demanded complete concentration. The tactical risk was enormous, but Emma understood that Park would die without immediate medical intervention that only she could provide. Staff Sergeant Morrison positioned himself to provide covering fire while Emma worked on Park's injuries, his rifle held awkwardly in his uninjured hand as he scanned the canyon walls for muzzle flashes that might indicate immediate threats. Morrison's wound was affecting his combat effectiveness, but his presence provided psychological support that helped Emma maintain focus on her medical responsibilities despite the bullets that continued to strike the ground around their position. The sound of helicopters approaching from the direction of forward operating base Atlas provided the first indication that relief might be possible, though Emma knew that the narrow canyon confines would make helicopter operations extremely dangerous. The aircraft would need to establish suppressive fire against the elevated enemy positions before any evacuation could be attempted.
and even then the tactical situation might prevent medical evacuation of the most seriously wounded Marines. Emma applied combat tourniquets to Park's extremity wounds while working to control bleeding from the torso injuries that posed the greatest immediate threat to her survival. Park's blood pressure was dropping rapidly, indicating shock that required aggressive fluid replacement and blood products that weren't available in Emma's field medical kit. Emma understood that Park's survival depended on rapid evacuation to a surgical facility, but first she needed to stabilize the Marine's condition enough to survive transport. Private Thompson provided security and assistance as Emma worked on Park's injuries, his rifle adding to the defensive fire that Morrison was providing from his increasingly weakened position. Thompson's presence allowed Emma to focus completely on her medical responsibilities while maintaining confidence that someone was watching for immediate threats that might require her to interrupt treatment and seek cover. The helicopter gunships that appeared above the canyon represented the kind of overwhelming firepower that could shift tactical situations rapidly, but their effectiveness would depend on identifying enemy positions that were carefully concealed among the rocky terrain. Emma could hear the aircraft's weapons engaging targets on the canyon walls, creating explosions that echoed through the narrow passage while hopefully suppressing the hostile fire that had trapped the Marine convoy. Lance Corporal Johnson's voice crackled through the radio with reports that Forward Operating Base Atlas was launching a ground rescue operation that would attempt to reach the convoy's position within 2 hours. 2 hours represented an eternity for Marines with serious injuries who needed immediate surgical intervention, but it also provided a timeline that allowed Emma to focus on keeping casualties alive until more comprehensive medical support could reach their position. Emma moved to the overturned supply truck where Morrison had reported additional casualties, crossing open ground that was still being swept by sporadic enemy fire despite the helicopter suppression efforts. The tactical situation remained dangerous, but the concentrated hostile fire had been reduced to manageable levels that allowed careful movement between positions. Emma's confidence had grown during her treatment of the previous casualties, replacing initial fear with the kind of professional competence that allowed her to function effectively under extreme stress. The supply truck's cab contained 2 Marines with injuries that required immediate assessment and treatment. The driver, Private Ryan Carter, had sustained a concussion when the vehicle overturned, leaving him disoriented but conscious. The vehicle commander, Corporal Ashley Taylor, had been thrown against the truck's interior during the crash, resulting in suspected internal injuries that were difficult to assess under field conditions but might become life-threatening without proper medical monitoring. Emma's examination of Taylor revealed signs of internal bleeding that required immediate evacuation to a surgical facility, but Taylor's condition was stable enough to allow treatment of other casualties who might have more immediate life-threatening injuries. Emma administered pain medication and established intravenous access that would allow rapid fluid replacement if Taylor's condition deteriorated during the wait for evacuation support. Private Carter's head injury required careful monitoring for signs of increasing intracranial pressure that could become rapidly fatal without surgical intervention. Emma's assessment suggested that Carter had sustained a significant concussion but hadn't suffered skull fracture or brain injury that would require immediate surgical treatment. She established neurological monitoring protocols that would allow early detection of any deterioration in Carter's condition. The 3rd Marine trapped in the supply vehicle was Lance Corporal Michael Davis, whose injuries were the most serious Emma had encountered during the engagement. Davis had been struck by multiple bullets during the initial ambush, sustaining wounds to his chest and abdomen that had created a medical emergency requiring immediate surgical intervention to prevent death from blood loss and organ damage. Emma realized that Davis represented her greatest medical challenge, requiring procedures that pushed the limits of field medical capabilities. Emma's treatment of Davis required her to perform emergency surgical procedures under combat conditions, using techniques learned during advanced trauma training but never applied under the stress of actual battlefield conditions. Davis was conscious but in severe pain, requiring pain management that would allow Emma to work while maintaining his cooperation during procedures that would be agonizing without adequate anesthesia. The sound of approaching ground vehicles indicated that the rescue operation from Forward Operating Base Atlas was making faster progress than initially estimated, possibly arriving within 90 minutes rather than the 2 hours originally projected. The acceleration of the rescue timeline created both relief and additional pressure, as Emma needed to ensure that all casualties were stabilized for transport while preparing them for evacuation procedures that would occur under continued threat of enemy contact. Staff Sergeant Morrison appeared beside the supply truck despite his injury, his determination to account for all Marines under his command overriding the pain and weakness caused by his shoulder wound. Morrison's presence provided command authority that helped coordinate the casualty collection and treatment activities while maintaining security awareness that remained essential despite the apparent reduction in hostile fire. Emma's medical pack was nearly depleted after treating multiple serious casualties, requiring her to improvise solutions using equipment and supplies available from the disabled vehicles and the scattered medical supplies from the overturned truck. Her ability to adapt field medical procedures to available resources demonstrated the kind of tactical flexibility that separated exceptional medics from those who could only function when provided with optimal equipment and conditions. Lance Corporal Johnson established communication with the approaching rescue force, providing tactical updates about the casualty situation and the security conditions that would affect evacuation procedures. Johnson's radio work was professional and thorough, ensuring that the rescue elements would arrive prepared for the medical and tactical challenges they would encounter when they reached the convoy's position. The helicopter gunships continued to patrol the canyon walls, searching for remaining enemy positions while providing overwatch for the ground rescue operation that was approaching through the narrow mountain passes. The aircraft represented a psychological boost for the trapped Marines, demonstrating that they hadn't been abandoned and that significant resources were being committed to their rescue and evacuation. Emma moved between casualties, monitoring their conditions while adjusting treatments based on changes in their medical status and the available supplies remaining in her kit. Davis required constant attention to maintain his blood pressure and airway, while Park needed monitoring for signs of shock that could become rapidly fatal. Taylor's internal injuries remained stable, but Emma knew that appearance could be deceptive with abdominal trauma that might worsen without warning. Private Brooks appeared beside Emma carrying additional medical supplies that he had gathered from the various vehicles, his initiative in collecting resources demonstrating the kind of tactical thinking that kept Marines alive during extended engagements. Brooks's supplies included items that Emma needed to continue treating the most seriously wounded Marines while maintaining their stability until professional evacuation could be accomplished. The rescue convoy's arrival was announced by the sound of heavy vehicles navigating the difficult terrain leading into Devil's Canyon, their engines straining against the steep grades while their crews prepared for immediate casualty evacuation procedures. Emma knew that the arrival of additional medical personnel and evacuation capabilities would transform the tactical situation, but she also understood that her work during the previous hours had determined whether several Marines would survive to benefit from that advanced medical support. Captain Mitchell's voice came through the radio as the rescue elements reached the convoy's position, her tone reflecting both relief at finding survivors and concern about the casualty reports that had been transmitted during the engagement. Mitchell's presence represented command authority that would coordinate the complex evacuation procedures required to move wounded Marines through difficult terrain to medical facilities equipped for advanced trauma treatment. Emma's hands were stained with the blood of Marines whose lives she had fought to save during the longest hours of her military career, but her medical assessment indicated that every casualty under her care had survived injuries that might have been fatal without immediate field treatment. Her small frame, which had been the subject of skepticism and doubt, had proven capable of performing under combat stress that would have challenged much larger and more experienced medical personnel. The helicopter medical evacuation teams that arrived with the rescue convoy brought the kind of advanced medical equipment and expertise that could provide definitive treatment for the most seriously wounded Marines. Emma's field medical work had successfully stabilized every casualty long enough for professional evacuation, achieving the primary objective of combat medical care, keeping wounded warriors alive until comprehensive medical support could take over their treatment. Staff Sergeant Morrison's assessment of Emma's performance during the engagement was transmitted to Captain Mitchell and would eventually become part of the official record documenting the convoy engagement and rescue operation. Morrison's report would describe medical care provided under combat conditions that exceeded training scenarios, demonstrating courage and competence that had saved multiple Marine lives during their most desperate hour. Part 5. The Warrior Revealed. 3 weeks after the ambush in Devil's Canyon, Emma Rodriguez stood in the main briefing room at Forward Operating Base Atlas, her uniform bearing new decorations that reflected recognition of her actions during the convoy engagement. The Bronze Star Medal with Combat Distinguishing Device rested above her left breast pocket, a tangible symbol of valor that had transformed her from the doubted newcomer into one of the most respected Marines on the base. The ceremony that had awarded the medal drew attendance from Marines throughout the operational area, including officers who had traveled significant distances to witness the recognition of extraordinary courage under fire. Captain Sarah Mitchell addressed the assembled Marines with the kind of pride that came from commanding personnel who had demonstrated the finest traditions of Marine Corps service. Mitchell's words during the award ceremony had emphasized not just Emma's medical competence, but her leadership under conditions that had tested every aspect of her character and training. The captain's speech had noted that Emma's actions had resulted in the survival of every Marine wounded during the ambush, achieving a zero-fatality outcome that military medical professionals recognized as remarkable given the severity of the engagement. Staff Sergeant Jake Morrison sat in the front row of the briefing room, his left arm still in a sling from the shoulder wound he had sustained during the Canyon engagement. Morrison's presence at the ceremony carried special significance, as his initial skepticism about Emma's capabilities had been completely transformed by witnessing her performance under combat conditions that would have challenged the most experienced medical personnel. His recommendation for Emma's decoration had been unqualified in its praise, describing medical care that had exceeded every standard for combat performance. The official citation accompanying Emma's Bronze Star Medal detailed her actions with the kind of precise language that military records use to document extraordinary service. The citation described how Emma had crossed open ground under hostile fire to reach wounded Marines, had performed advanced medical procedures under combat conditions, and had successfully stabilized multiple casualties with life-threatening injuries. The document noted that her actions had occurred despite her small physical stature and limited combat experience, emphasizing that her courage and competence had proven that heroism comes in all sizes. Lance Corporal Marcus Johnson, whose radio communications during the ambush had helped coordinate the rescue operation, had requested permission to speak during the ceremony about Emma's impact on unit morale and effectiveness. Johnson's remarks focused on how Emma's performance had demonstrated that dedication and skill mattered more than physical appearance, inspiring other Marines to reconsider their own assumptions about what determined military effectiveness. His words carried particular weight because his initial nervousness about serving with Emma had been obvious to everyone in the unit. Private First Class Kevin Brooks, whose life Emma had saved during her first month at the base, had been selected to present Emma with a unit coin that had been specially designed to commemorate the Devil's Canyon engagement. The coin featured imagery representing the mountainous terrain where the ambush had occurred, along with medical symbols that honored Emma's role in ensuring that every Marine had survived the encounter. Brooks' presentation speech was brief but heartfelt, acknowledging that Emma's diagnostic skills and combat medical care had saved his life twice, once in the base medical facility and again during the Canyon engagement. The transformation in how Marines throughout Forward Operating Base Atlas viewed Emma was evident in countless small interactions that had evolved during the weeks following the Canyon engagement. Marines who had previously been polite but distant now sought her out for conversation, asked her opinion on matters extending beyond medical issues, and included her in the kind of informal social activities that indicated full acceptance within the military community. The change wasn't dramatic or sudden, but it was unmistakable to anyone who observed the daily rhythms of life on the base. Corporal Tyler Washington, Emma's fellow medic who had provided encouragement before her first combat mission, had become her closest friend and professional colleague on the base. Washington's respect for Emma's medical skills had been evident from their first meeting, but his admiration for her courage under fire had deepened their professional relationship into genuine friendship. Washington often sought Emma's advice on challenging medical cases, recognizing that her analytical approach to diagnosis and treatment had proven superior to his own in several instances. The medical facility at Forward Operating Base Atlas had been renamed the Rodriguez Treatment Center, in an unofficial ceremony that reflected the Marines' desire to honor Emma's contributions to their welfare and safety. The name change wasn't authorized by higher headquarters, but it appeared on hand-lettered signs throughout the facility and was used consistently in verbal references by Marines receiving medical care. Captain Mitchell had chosen not to interfere with the informal naming, understanding that it represented the kind of grassroots recognition that carried more meaning than official designations. Emma's daily routine had expanded to include training responsibilities that reflected her new status as the base's most experienced combat medic. Young Marines arriving at Forward Operating Base Atlas now received medical training that included Emma's first-hand insights into battlefield medicine, learning from someone whose theoretical knowledge had been validated through actual combat experience. Emma's teaching approach emphasized the psychological aspects of combat medical care, helping new medics understand how to maintain effectiveness when treating wounded Marines under fire. The Marine Corps had requested that Emma participate in a training video project designed to illustrate proper combat medical procedures for distribution throughout the military medical community. The video would feature Emma demonstrating techniques that had proven effective during the Canyon engagement, providing professional education that could save lives in future combat situations. Emma's initial reluctance to participate in what felt like self-promotion had been overcome by understanding that sharing her experiences could help other medics perform better when their Marines needed life-saving medical care. Private Danny Williams, who had regained consciousness in the base hospital after sustaining his head injury during the ambush, had requested permission to transfer into medical training so that he could work alongside Emma in the base medical facility. Williams' interest in medical training had been inspired by witnessing Emma's performance during the engagement, recognizing that medical personnel played crucial roles in ensuring Marine survival and mission success. His request had been approved by Captain Mitchell, who understood that Emma's example was inspiring Marines to consider military occupational specialties they might not have previously contemplated. The intelligence analysis of the Devil's Canyon engagement had revealed that the attacking force had numbered 23 fighters armed with military-grade weapons and equipment. The enemy force had been positioned in carefully prepared defensive positions that demonstrated professional military training and tactical knowledge. Emma's successful treatment of wounded Marines under such intense and sustained hostile fire was recognized by military medical professionals as an exceptional achievement that warranted study and documentation for future training purposes. Master Sergeant David Chen,
Emma's former instructor at the Naval Medical Center had traveled to Forward Operating Base Atlas to personally congratulate Emma on her combat performance and to discuss her future career opportunities within military medicine. Chen's visit represented recognition from the broader military medical community that Emma's achievements had established her as a rising star, whose potential for continued service and leadership was exceptional. Chen's discussions with Emma focused on advanced training opportunities that could prepare her for positions of greater responsibility within military medical organizations. The psychological impact of Emma's performance extended beyond the Marines directly involved in the Canyon engagement to affect the entire population of Forward Operating Base Atlas. Her example had demonstrated that courage and competence could overcome physical limitations and initial skepticism, inspiring other Marines to reconsider their own assumptions about what they might be capable of achieving under extreme circumstances. The base's overall morale and confidence had increased measurably, with Marines expressing greater confidence in their medical support and in their ability to survive and recover from combat injuries. Emma's correspondence with her family in Riverside, California, had described her combat experience in terms that emphasized her professional satisfaction with being able to help fellow Marines while downplaying the personal dangers she had faced. Her parents, who had initially worried that their daughter was too small for military service, now expressed pride in her achievements while continuing to worry about her safety during the remainder of her deployment. Emma's letters home focused on the positive aspects of her military experience, describing the friendships she had formed and the professional skills she was developing. The official investigation of the convoy engagement had resulted in several Marines receiving recognition for their performance during the ambush and rescue operation. Staff Sergeant Morrison had been awarded the Purple Heart for his combat wounds and recommended for the Bronze Star Medal for his leadership during the engagement. Private Brooks had received a commendation for his exceptional driving skills that had kept his vehicle operational despite significant damage. Lance Corporal Johnson had been recognized for his communications work that had coordinated the rescue operation. Captain Mitchell's after-action report had emphasized the crucial role that Emma's medical care had played in preventing fatalities during the engagement, noting that the survival of all wounded Marines represented an exceptional outcome that reflected both individual heroism and effective unit training. Mitchell's report had been forwarded to higher headquarters as an example of outstanding small unit performance under combat conditions, potentially influencing future training and doctrine development for similar situations. The recovery of all Marines wounded during the Canyon engagement had proceeded faster than medical professionals had initially predicted, with several Marines returning to full duty within weeks of the ambush. Lance Corporal Maria Santos, whose leg fracture had been immobilized by Emma's field treatment, had credited Emma's immediate medical care with preventing complications that could have resulted in permanent disability. Corporal Lisa Park, whose torso wounds had been the most life-threatening injuries sustained during the engagement, had made a complete recovery and returned to combat duty with full medical clearance. Emma's personal growth during her first combat deployment was evident to anyone who observed her daily interactions with fellow Marines and her approach to medical responsibilities. The nervous uncertainty that had characterized her arrival at Forward Operating Base Atlas had been replaced by quiet confidence that came from proven performance under the most challenging conditions. Emma's voice carried authority when she discussed medical matters, and her opinions were sought by Marines throughout the base on issues extending far beyond her medical responsibilities. The influence of Emma's example extended beyond Forward Operating Base Atlas to affect other military units that had received reports of her performance during the Canyon engagement. Young women considering military careers had contacted Emma through official channels, seeking advice about pursuing military medical training and asking about the challenges they might face as female Marines in combat environments. Emma's responses emphasized the importance of dedication and preparation while acknowledging that physical and social challenges were real but could be overcome through perseverance and professional competence. Emma's future military career options had expanded significantly as a result of her combat performance, with several advanced training opportunities becoming available that would prepare her for positions of greater responsibility within military medical organizations. Emma was considering applications for officer training programs that could lead to positions where she could influence military medical policy and training development. Her combat experience provided credibility that would make her an effective advocate for improvements in combat medical care and training. The unofficial motto that had developed among Marines at Forward Operating Base Atlas was "Size doesn't matter, heart does," a phrase that had appeared on hand-lettered signs throughout the base and was used consistently in conversations about Emma's achievements. The motto reflected the lesson that Marines had learned from witnessing Emma's performance, that courage, competence, and dedication were more important than physical attributes in determining military effectiveness. Emma's daily medical responsibilities continued to include both routine healthcare and emergency treatment, but her approach to patient care had been influenced by her combat experience in ways that made her more effective as a medical professional. Emma's understanding of how Marines responded to medical treatment under stress had improved her ability to provide care that addressed both physical injuries and psychological concerns.
Her bedside manner had developed a quality of calm authority that helped patients feel confident in her medical judgment. The respect that Emma had earned from Marines throughout Forward Operating Base Atlas was evident in the way they responded to her medical instructions and recommendations. Marines who might have questioned her authority before the Canyon engagement now followed her medical advice without hesitation, understanding that her judgment had been proven under conditions where mistakes could have fatal consequences. Emma's medical authority was now unquestioned throughout the base, representing complete professional acceptance by the Marines she served. As Emma approached the end of her first combat deployment, she reflected on the transformation she had undergone from the uncertain newcomer who had arrived at Forward Operating Base Atlas to the respected combat veteran who had proven herself under fire. The journey had been challenging in ways that no amount of training could have fully prepared her for, but it had also been rewarding in ways that civilian life could never replicate. Emma understood that she had found her place within the Marine Corps community and that her future military career would be built on the foundation of respect and trust she had earned through her performance when it mattered most. The legacy of Emma's service at Forward Operating Base Atlas would extend far beyond her individual achievements to influence how Marines throughout the military viewed the relationship between physical attributes and military effectiveness. Her example had demonstrated that the Marine Corps' core values of honor, courage, and commitment were not limited by physical size or gender, but were available to anyone willing to embrace them fully and live them consistently under the most challenging circumstances. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.